What we're really suffering from is grind culture and from not having community support systems because
Yeah.
in our evolutionary past, humans lived in groups of 25 people and children were raised collectively. So there was like a ratio of 5 adults to every one child in a community. And so everyone
Yeah.
had tons of help.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Ancient Intelligence. You've got your host, Anya Shack here, and today we have a special guest episode. I am joined by Elena Bridgers. She is a woman that I have come to find very fascinating over the last couple of months. Actually, a good friend of mine who lives in Switzerland, who just became a new mom, actually turned me on to her. So she had been following her content because she is a science writer, she's a content creator, she's a mom of two, and she's got this really special fascination with hunter-gatherer civilizations and evolution just in general. And so I'm fascinated by that too, and I really wanted to have a conversation with her. And today we're going to talk about the patriarchy. Very hot topic word, but we're going to dissect it. We're going to get into um, the patriarchy from an evolutionary perspective. I'm really excited to learn from her and for you all to hear this fascinating woman. So she has published in some peer-reviewed scientific journals. She's been in lots of major media outlets. She actually grew her Instagram from 0 to 50,000 in just a couple of months. And so she's working on a book, and I'm just really excited to welcome Elena Bridgers. Hello.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Yeah, I just started all of this work and research very recently, and I think that, seeing my account grow so fast is just validation of how much interest there is in this topic, and especially for women and mothers in trying to understand more about what our evolutionary legacy is as a species and how we use, like, what life was like for women and mothers in our evolutionary past, because there are so many layers of cultural complexity that have kind of come in on top of that over the years that sometimes it's sort of hard to get back in touch with what sort of our animal nature is, almost, if you will. And so I think that's why so many people are interested in learning about this. But what I also think is fascinating is that it's not what most people think it is. Like our evolutionary story as women, there's so much misinformation out there about what it actually was like that informs a lot of our thinking about what a woman's role is in the modern context and what a man's role is. And so one thing I really like to do, and one of the reasons I wanted to come on your show, is to kind of debunk some of those myths. Um, yeah, just have a conversation about gender, I guess, in evolutionary terms and how that informs modern society.
I love it. That's such a beautiful preface to, I guess, just going into one of my first questions. So, as a woman, I want to be purposeful. I want to be like fully expressed. And I also want the men in my life to be purposeful and fully expressed. I want us all to feel like we're doing what, we feel we should be doing in life. And so I know these days sometimes life can, modern media, the narrative, all of that can kind of pin one sex against the other. And so what I'm really excited to do is just get into, yeah, like what was it like? And what had you first get interested in this topic first? And then I would love to hear like what was it like back then for women? And then
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. I love that. So I got interested, I guess, in human evolution and human behavior a long time ago. I studied human biology at Stanford as an undergrad, and I was a teaching assistant for Robert Sapolsky, who was kind of a major thinker in evolutionary biology. And so, I even briefly considered a career in academia and going deeper on that, and then ultimately decided not to take that path. Ultimately decided not to take that path. But I have always had this fascination with the story of human evolution. And then what really rekindled my interest in it was when I became a mother, because my experience of motherhood was so challenging.
Mm,
And I think that experience is challenging for a lot of women and mothers in the modern
Mm,
context. And we're all kind of left asking ourselves the question of why is this so hard and has it always been this hard? What can we do to make it easier? And
mm,
so naturally, I just kind of found myself gravitating towards the research on hunter-gatherer societies and our evolutionary history in order to try and understand what motherhood was like in those societies
mm.
and to kind of see if that could inform why our experience of motherhood is so hard in the modern context. And yeah, I was amazed by what I found, and I was excited to start writing about that and sharing it on my Substack and on my social. And
Yeah.
yeah, it started getting crazy engagement because people, I guess other people want to know this too. And
We need
it's kind
help.
of, yeah, it's kind of crazy to me that it's
Yeah.
not common knowledge that this is like not part of our education,
Yeah.
like understanding our evolutionary legacy as
Yes.
human animals.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so yeah, that's what drew me to this initially. And yeah, I guess the rest was history.
I love it. Well, let's dive right in. That's very beautiful. I'm always fascinated by the human animal, and I've I research a lot of Alison Armstrong, and she is someone that I think she plays a little fast and loose with the hunter-gatherer terminology, to be honest, but she does it in an effort to bring men and women closer together. She's trying to
Interesting.
explain our differences, and she does use the terminology hunter, man, gatherer, woman very clearly. And I'm curious, is that a misconception or is that how it was?
So this is a very controversial topic.
Okay,
Um,
love it. Right
and
away.
I think it depends who you ask.
Okay.
So there are some academics who are actively challenging the idea that the role of women was always gathering and that the role of men was always hunting. There's some research to indicate that in Neanderthal society, women actually did hunt quite a
Mm,
lot more than we used to think.
mm,
Um, so it's entirely possible that, for some human species in our evolutionary past, there was more female hunting than previously believed. Um, and when we look to contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, because, we have the fossil record, which is one method for understanding how humans lived in our evolutionary past, and then another method that anthropologists use to study what human social structure was like in our evolutionary past is studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, because the thinking is that, these people are not living fossils, but they live in a set of circumstances, in an environment, an ecology that is very similar to what all humans lived in our shared evolutionary past. And so by studying them, we can understand more about how humans lived
got
in the
it.
past. And so um, evolutionary biologists tend to focus on something called immediate return hunter-gatherers, which are hunter-gatherers. They don't store resources. It's just they go out, they hunt, they gather, and they immediately consume whatever they collect. And that's really important because those societies tend to have very different social structures
Mm,
than hunter-gatherers who accumulate and defend resources. And we can
okay.
get into that and the implications for like
Great.
patriarchy versus not patriarchy
Yes.
later. Just to answer the question on hunting and gathering, in those societies, those immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, which is how all humans live for 95% of our evolutionary history as a species,
Yep.
the women mostly gather and the men mostly hunt.
Yeah.
These gender roles are very strict.
Right.
There are a few societies in which the women hunt, and they tend to be very good at it. So they're certainly capable.
Right.
It's just that it tends to not be as compatible with childcare. And the way that this worked in our evolutionary past is that women would leave children who were weaned, so children like over the age of 3, to
Mm,
play in a multi-age play group in camp, and they
hmm.
would go out and gather and forage. But they would take children that were still nursing with them, carry
Right.
them on their backs, and then they would, dig for tubers or gather berries or their whatever that work was with the babies with them. And hunting tends to be I mean, if you watch like documentaries on how the Kung lived, that's exclamation point Kung. There are some fascinating documentaries out there by John Marshall. One of them is called The Hunters, and he actually documents a group of Kung men hunting down a giraffe. And it's a 3-day process. First, they shoot the giraffe with a poison arrow, which slows it down, and then they chase it across the savannah for like 3 days and nights. They don't sleep, they hardly eat, they hardly drink water. They have to defend this animal from other predators that are
Right.
trying to catch it. Then it's actually quite heart-wrenching to watch, like as someone who's a former vegetarian. But in the end, they end up killing this animal. It's this very intense athletic process that just frankly, if you watch that, you're like that you can't do that with a baby on your back, right? You can't do that while
Absolutely.
you're nursing. And so, I think a lot of evolutionary biologists agree that the reason why we have this division of labor has a lot to do with our biology, that where women bear children and feed children, and nursing, children was a matter of life and death in those societies. You had to breastfeed for 2, 3 years if you wanted your child to survive.
Yeah.
Um, and so that informed a lot of how society was structured, and what women's work was and what men's work was. But the one thing that I love to remind people of is that even though women typically did not hunt, they typically gathered. Gathering brought in more calories than hunting did. So women's subsistence work was
Mhm.
actually more critical to group survival than men's hunting work. And so I like to think of calories as money in the evolutionary past. So
Mhm.
women were kind of the primary breadwinners.
Yeah.
And that really mattered to the way that society was structured because women were so important in that sense to society, not just in terms of their contribution to child rearing and domestic work, they had a lot of power. They had equal say in group decision making. They could leave bad marriages because they weren't like dependent on a husband providing.
Mm.
Um, they were just generally, like most anthropologists agree, quite quite vocal.
Mm.
There was no kind of culture of like female subservience to the male. Um, most anthropologists would not say that immediate return hunter-gatherer societies are patriarchal. They're not matriarchal either. They're neither. Male lineage was not traced through men. And men had no more power in the community and in group decisions than women did. And that is no longer the case. I mean, if you use that as sort of the definition of patriarchy, which many anthropologists do, then I think, you can argue that today we almost certainly live in a patriarchal society. Men do hold, in general, more positions of power. We
Right.
trace lineage through the male line. And that's not to say that it's good or bad. It's just how it is. And that's how society evolved over time. But I do like to set the record straight on the fact that things were not always that way,
Yeah.
for the vast majority of our history.
That's really beautiful. And, I've always thought about, hey, we're not valuing women because women's roles have always been so intangible, right? The
Hmm.
caretaking, everything that happens behind the scenes, the helping the sick, the doing all of the things that keep the tribe together has been the woman's role. And that's what I've always learned and heard. And so it's
Hmm.
hard to like put a monetary, value on, oh, that's how much game she brought in, right?
Hmm.
And so when
Hmm.
you're talking about calories, I really like that because it's nice to show that, yeah, it's always been this kind of co-creative, complementary, symbiotic relationship between men and women, which is what I would love to see in the world.
Yes, and I do like how I listened to a couple of your previous episodes. I like how you frame the real enemy as being like capitalism and consumerism and grind culture. And I agree with you on that. Like, I think if you look to the way that hunter-gatherer societies were structured, they had far more leisure time than
Yeah,
we do in modern society. Like typically they spent, I mean, most anthropologists think probably about half of their waking hours in just pure leisure, socializing, resting, taking care of their bodies. And the rest of the time was divided between the kind of economic labor of hunting and gathering and childcare and domestic care. And men did do childcare and a fair amount of domestic work as well. You know, women, because of breastfeeding, again, did more of the childcare
right,
related work. But also, I think it's really important to remember that our evolutionary legacy is really one of community and sharing. We lived in these groups of 25 people, and the fruits of our labor were shared collectively with the group. So, in that sense, everyone is contributing something to the group, and we were taking care of one another collectively, the men and the women.
right.
And so, yeah, I think that, in modern society, we've lost that sense of community. We've been cut off from nature. We're like stuck in this capitalist grind culture. And because we idolize the sort of high achieving working male, like that has also become the aspirational thing for women, especially for women who consider themselves feminists
Right,
often,
right.
which, like, I think it's okay to push back against that and say, like, a lot of people, men and women, don't want that for themselves. Like, we want more rest. We want more connection with community. We want more time in nature, whatever it is, right?
Yeah. It sounds to me like it's almost like we moved from this nurturing, kind of need-based, tribal, cooperative environment to something like progress-focused, growth-based. And it seems to me like when you think about going from that to that, I actually I don't know any other way to do that than by creating hierarchies and
Hmm.
by creating patriarchy, and not in the
Hmm.
bad sense, because in the sense of just like benevolent, hopefully, males that protect the people in their circle because
Hmm.
there are intruders, because people are trying to
Hmm.
steal from
Hmm.
you, because there
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
danger. And so that's almost how I see that shift is what do you think? How do you feel about
Yeah, no, you're right. I think, on the one hand, we can say humans were not patriarchal for most of our history. And on
that?
the other hand, the emergence of the patriarchy was kind of inevitable. Because I think what happened, and again, there's a lot of debate and controversy around this, but most anthropologists agree on the fact that as soon as humans started settling and accumulating resources, then suddenly there was a need to guard those resources. And so that necessitated the emergence of kind of a warring class. And the men were generally the defenders and the warriors. And so that kind of naturally led to these more patriarchal societies wherein, humans were either through agriculture or through pastoralism, like accumulating resources like livestock or stockpiling agricultural goods. And then they needed to defend those from neighboring warring groups. And
Yeah,
so there suddenly was this emphasis on training boys and men to become a warring class. And then prestige and status was associated with warfare and, being a better warrior. And that also then in turn translated into certain men accumulating more goods and resources than others. And so there was this
right.
stratification and inequality that emerged in society, which then also in turn led to like polygamy. And because our
Right.
legacy is mostly monogamous, like if you look to hunter-gatherer societies, mostly monogamous relationships,
Mm,
serial monogamy was typically how anthropologists define it. So humans are not necessarily just having one relationship for life, but one at a time.
got it. That's what
um,
that means. Okay, got it.
yeah. But then when we shifted to to resource accumulation and inequality,
Mm.
what happened is that the wealthier men who accumulated more resources had the means to take on more wives,
Yeah.
and produce more children. And also, what we know is that in these societies, because women were able to wean earlier by transitioning children onto animal milk, for instance, which wasn't something that was possible in the hunter-gatherer lifestyle,
Mm.
they produced more children.
Wow.
Birth spacing started getting closer. And so, actually, the societies that transitioned to agriculture and to pastoralism were literally outproducing their neighbors. And then on
Wow.
top of it, because they developed this warrior class, they were able to like conquer and defend land and territory. So ultimately, that just pushed the hunter-gatherers out, right? Like
Right.
hunting and gathering was no longer like a viable survival
Right.
strategy once people started to settle. And so, all of that led to a patriarchal society, and we're still living in one. And I think you could still argue that to a large extent, like we are a warring society. So I don't know, do we need that kind of patriarchal protection? I don't know. All I know is that with the emergence of the patriarchy came the emergence of more violence, more homicide,
Mm.
more sexual assault, more like things that most humans are like, those are not great features of
Right.
society.
Right.
But also like it's no one's fault. It was
Right.
just kind of like the natural progression of how things moved through history. And so when I talk about patriarchy and feminism and these things, I try to remind people that we're not trying to point fingers and blame. Like our objective is to move towards a more harmonious and peaceful society. Well, at least I think that we
Yeah.
should try to move towards a society that promotes human flourishing, both for
Yeah.
men and women. And that might mean rethinking certain aspects of our very stratified, unequal, patriarchal society, but it doesn't mean that we're attacking men.
That's,
Um,
yeah, you know what? I think just hearing you speak on that, I think that's a really beautiful thing to point out. I think that's actually like I envision you talking about like the warrior class and the few men at the top that suddenly have, hundreds of wives. I almost envision like the billionaires of today, right? You think about the billionaires of today. I don't know what their personal lives are like, but the idea is that when you talk about patriarchy, it's yes, we need national security. We need national security now.
Mhm.
There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of terror, there are a lot of things going on. And it's just such a tiny percentage of men holding this power. Meanwhile, when we talk about patriarchy, I think all the other men, like the other 99%, feel personally attacked. And
Yes.
it's so frustrating, I think, for them because a lot of them are just, especially the blue collar guys that are just trying to make a living. And I think we've got to find a way to separate that conversation from like, the men are the problem conversation because it's so hard for everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, the gender wars are crazy right now. And I think that the future I want is a future in which everyone feels valued and feels that they matter, right? And we know that that's like a really critical component objectively of human flourishing. This has been measured and studied. And so I think a lot of the kind of smashing the patriarchy rhetoric can feel very demeaning to a lot of men and make them feel like their contribution and role in society is not valued. And I think that, like, when I think about my own relationship, it's really hard in the modern context, especially when everyone is so time poor. And especially this is true when you have children, if you're both working full-time jobs, or even if you're
Right.
not and one person is home with the kids, no one feels like they have enough time. No one feels like they have enough support. And so then husbands and wives turn against each other. And it blows up a lot of marriages. And what we're really suffering from is grind culture and from not having community support systems because
Yeah.
in our evolutionary past, humans lived in groups of 25 people and children were raised collectively. So there was like a ratio of 5 adults to every one child in a community. And so everyone
Yeah.
had tons of help. And so I think it's a shame that these days, so much of the conversation has been focused on like, well, how do we split everything in a marriage 50-50?
Yeah.
And even if you manage that, even if you get to 50-50, everyone's still maxed out. And so,
Yeah.
it just like causes a lot of that stress. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is how a lot of the conversation is around like splitting everything 50-50. Um, when in fact, I mean, I do kind of think that, especially in motherhood, there are certain things that, like breastfeeding, if you choose to breastfeed, have to fall to the mother. And so then it's like, well, how do you make allowances for that work in society and still keep equity in like a relationship and also in society at large without everyone having to be the same and hold the same roles and do the same things?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting conversation that I think we need to have as a society, but is like very tricky conversation to have right now. So
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I think it's super tricky, and I think there's a major difference between like individual personal desires and what might be best for society or what might be best for birth rates. And
hmm
that's a really tough conversation to have because everyone wants to do what they want to do. Um,
hmm
and I think, for example, we can't go back, I guess, 14,000 years ago and do life that way. But in the modern moment, I do feel strongly that there is some opportunity to rethink the idea of, I guess, pre-industrial co-creative partnership I mean, agrarian pre-industrial co-creative partnership. I think they did focus a lot on survival then, and I think
hmm
today we're
hmm
not focused on survival. But
hmm
I guess what I'm saying without trying to hedge at all is like one income, right? The idea that it is more beneficial for a woman to not go to work,
hmm
um, and it's more beneficial for a man to go to work. I'm just curious what you think about that in this moment, in this day and age, thinking about motherhood. And for me, I've I have a hard time with the notion that like a woman can't be creative and intelligent and thoughtful and be interested in what she's interested in if she's not going to a job. And I don't like that. And so I'm trying to debunk that part. I'm curious how you feel about those conversations these days.
It is such a hot button topic, and I think it's a conversation worth having. And I think that most people aren't willing to look at the nuance in this conversation and say, like, it doesn't have to be like this war where we are, working
Yeah.
moms against stay-at-home moms and
Yeah.
one model is better than another. I actually think that both models of motherhood that we have in the modern context, like the isolated stay-at-home mom in the single family home with multiple dependent children, like I think many women feel very frustrated and dissatisfied with that. And I also think that if you look at mothers who are working full time outside the home and just like dealing with capitalist grind culture and then coming home and still having to do a ton of care work and domestic work, they are also frustrated and burnt out. And so what we're seeing is women kind of whiplashing between these two extremes of, okay, well, we weren't satisfied with how things were in the 1950s, so let's push hard to like all become bankers and lawyers. But oh,
Yeah.
wait, this is also a total burnout and we have no time left for our kids or the things that matter. So maybe let's go back to the 1950s. And what I'm trying to say is there is this model for how humans lived and flourished for
Mm,
95% of our human history, which is neither. It's
I
neither of those things.
love that.
Like, it is literally like women are working and contributing to group survival and bringing home calories, but it's only taking up maybe 4 hours of their day. And the rest of the
Yeah.
time they're spending in community, socializing, doing, some domestic and childcare, but also doing creative work, also spending time doing like rituals or
Mhm.
dancing or singing or beadwork or, all of these things that none of us have time for anymore, but that are like a really lovely, enjoyable part of human existence.
Yeah.
And so I think that, yeah, like we've sort of again, to go back to to a point you make often is that, sort of consumerism and capitalism are the real enemy, not patriarchy, and I think those things are linked. But yeah, I think what most people want is just to be free to have more time to
Yeah.
do things outside of childcare, domestic work,
Yeah.
and economic work. But
Yeah.
I do think that I guess just to answer your last point, I do think that there is a danger in sort of going too far back to the full-time like stay-at-home mom or women not working at all because again, if we look at the anthropology of it, in those societies, what we give up is we tend to give up more say in group decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like the ability
Mm-hmm.
to leave an unhappy marriage,
Mm-hmm.
things that I think being able to make those choices, like it is a good thing for women. I also want to see more women in like scientific research, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that if we don't have women in scientific research, then we don't learn about, women's bodies, and then that negatively affects women's health. So I think the question is really, how do we move towards a future where we allow women to pursue these careers,
Mm-hmm.
but in a way that's balanced
Yeah.
and in a way that they still have time to take care of themselves, their children, their families, to
Yeah.
do things that are creative or, regenerative and not just exhausting, right?
Yeah, I think I think it's beautiful. I think a lot of men that I know might probably say, like especially in the 50s, I guess even before that, the idea that they would go to work and fulfill some sort of big personal dream is not really what was happening. They were just
Hmm.
doing what they had to do to bring money home so that their family would be comfortable. And I think there's so much rhetoric around that, like men have had all this time to do all of these things, but so many of them, you know, just survived. And I think there's this
Yeah.
idea maybe from them that's like, well, why couldn't women do all of those things at home, like while we
Hmm.
were at
Hmm.
work?
Hmm.
And it's a
Hmm.
really good question.
Hmm.
Obviously, not the participation in the public sphere and being in STEM and some of
Hmm.
those things you're referring to. And I feel like I know maybe some of the answer around like the isolation in the suburbs, especially in the
Yes.
West. But okay, because I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. I mean, just if I think of my paternal grandparents, for
Yep.
instance, they moved to Los Alamos, New Mexico, because my grandfather was actually part of the Los Alamos project. And so they moved far away from family and friends.
Yep.
They didn't know anyone there. My grandmother had four children in the space of 6 years, which that's like a whole other thing we could talk about from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, women's bodies are really not designed actually to have children less than 4 years apart. If you look to
Oh,
our
wow.
evolutionary history, birth spacing used to be much longer because of breastfeeding patterns and nutritional stress. And anyway, so 4 kids in 6 years and no help from family. And my paternal grandfather worked a lot. And yes, part of that was just, it was a question of survival. But I think one of the major differences was that, when I talked to my father and his siblings, uh, and also even in conversations I had with my grandfather still managed to find leisure time. Like he would go after work out to drinks with
Mm-hmm.
colleagues, or on the weekends, he would go golf. He loved to golf and he would be gone all day golfing with his friends. And I mean, I think, part of the justification for that was that it was actually for business and that he was networking and he was doing his best. And I love my paternal grandfather. And again, none of this is to like
Yeah.
point a finger at him and say
Yeah.
that he should have done better. I mean, this was just how things were in
Sure.
society at the time. But my grandmother had a mental breakdown and ended up in like a mental hospital for a brief stint because she was so exhausted and overwhelmed trying to care for these four children alone and with no break. She never got a break. And I think the thing is that care work, and especially care work of young children, is so intense and so all consuming that unless you have the power in your relationship or within, other relationships that you have
Yeah.
in society to say like, I need a break. Like I need paid childcare or help from family, or I need you, my partner, to take a stint. You never get
Break.
time off. You never get a break. And again, if we look to our evolutionary legacy, that it is not normal to not have time to rest and recover
Mm,
or to have leisure, because in our evolutionary past, what would have happened is most children would have integrated these multi-age playgroups where they were playing with older children. They were actively cared for by the older children, by multiple relatives in the society. Like they were taken care of, they were entertained. So a mother coming back from 4 hours of foraging was much more able to rest and relax in the context of
100%.
that community care than a mother inside a single family home, right? And so actually, I think you could really argue that it is the single family home that contributed to so much maternal burnout in the 1950s.
I'm just taking kind of like a bit of an analog. I have a friend who lives in rural Maine, and
Hmm.
she's got six children,
Hmm.
husband, and the reason their relationship works, and I'm literally connecting the dots thanks to what you're saying, is because he works remotely. So
Hmm.
his job doesn't cut into their social time. They're
Hmm.
part of a church community. Every single day while he's working, she and the kids go to this community where there are many elders and many
Hmm.
people, and it's literally why it works. And he
Hmm.
obviously he makes the money, and she's the
Hmm.
homemaker. And the only reason it works is because of those two factors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the community thing is huge. And I think, you can make an argument that mothers, this depends. I've thought a lot about this too, and I've interviewed different mothers in different religious communities. But in some religious communities, in many religious communities, the help and support that mothers receive through church and the religious network is huge. Like it can be a game changer.
Yeah.
And then there are other religious communities where I would say that like the expectations around gender roles
Mm,
and perfectionism
mm,
are so intense that it kind of ends up erasing any benefit that would come from the community.
yeah.
And it varies mother to mother and community to community, but yeah,
Yeah.
there is an interesting intersection, I think, of religion and motherhood and community and the role that that plays.
Beautiful. I love it. I'm curious. I know we're wrapping up here shortly. When it comes to the things that clearly make women feel better is
Hmm.
kin and community helping with child rearing, the ability to express much more rest time, a lot of
Hmm.
support. What do you
Hmm.
think, just from your perspective, men need right now?
That is so interesting. I highly recommend this book. I'm reading this book called Boy Mom,
Okay.
um, by Ruth. Oh shoot, I'm gonna get her last name wrong,
Boy,
but
mom.
you can look it up. Boy
Yeah.
Mom. And I'm actually gonna interview her on my Instagram live shortly, so worth tuning in for. She has a really interesting perspective as like a self-described feminist mother who's raising boys, and she talks all about how actually we have these stereotypes about boys being more rambunctious, more aggressive, and some of that is true, and there's definitely a biological aspect to that.
Hmm.
Um, and one thing that we never talk about is the fact that boys are actually more sensitive in many ways than girls. They take a little bit longer to mature. So developmentally, they're a little bit behind, and the regions in their brain involved in like emotional self-regulation and impulse control, in particular, mature later. And so, like as a mother, we tend to actually treat boys with less warmth and affection,
Mm-hmm.
but the research indicates they might actually need more because they're actually less independent than
Mm-hmm.
girls at an equivalent age, which is not
Hmm.
to say that girls don't need love and affection. All humans need love and affection.
Right.
But I think that one of the ways in which sort of patriarchal gender norms have objectively harmed men is that it has prevented us from treating boys and men in our lives with real empathy and love and affection.
Mm,
And all humans are sensitive to that. All humans need that, and men need that too. Men need friendship and connection and love and support and empathy. And
mm.
it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah,
We could say, we love men and we love women, and it's not like because
yeah,
we say that we love men that we don't love women. That's silly, right?
totally. I'm actually, ugh, I know I have to let you go, but man, I just really want to know. So I've read a couple of accounts, but when it comes to hunter-gatherers,
Mhm.
this whole idea of the boys being really well nurtured by their mothers and then
Mhm.
kind of at a certain age going off with the men because they've had this like
Mhm.
rite of passage. Is that something that you found in the
Yeah,
literature? Okay. I'm curious
definitely.
how the nurturing was with the mothers, speaking to this point. Like, were they very loving and the same way
Yes.
with boys and girls? How was it? Yeah.
Yeah, there's really no gender discrepancy in the way that children are treated. All children are treated with love
Yeah.
and affection. And the love and affection in hunter-gatherer societies, most anthropologists would agree, is extreme. It's actually kind of a beautiful thing. I think that what is so difficult in the modern context is that we expect overstretched parents and especially overstretched mothers alone, again, inside single family homes, to be able to provide that same level of
Yeah.
support and affection that would have been the responsibility of the entire community. So, like when you look at childhood in hunter-gatherer societies, most children are basically just like continuously held and nurtured until they're
Mm,
3 by someone.
mm,
But it's not possible to do that as a mother because you just don't have the time, and maybe you have multiple children, and
mm.
you're alone, and you also have to like cook dinner and do a Zoom call. I don't know, whatever your life is
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think that you could make a pretty strong argument that kids are missing that in modern society, and that maybe it partially explains why we have such high rates of anxiety and depression in the teenage years and adulthood, is because most of us aren't getting the love and attention and nurturance from the community that would have been the norm in our evolutionary past.
Yeah, I don't know anyone that I personally know that was held nonstop for 3 years.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah.
So, I really appreciate the nuance. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. I feel like I learned a lot of things about women and men. And anything else you want to share before we go?
No, thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation. I love talking to people who have different perspectives from mine and exchanging ideas. And yeah, I think what you're doing is interesting. It's such a polarized environment right now. I really want us to find ways of breaking through that. And yeah, just building more love and community. And I know that sounds corny, but it's what we need. It's objectively what we need to flourish as humans. We're social animals.
Both of us, like we have men and women, like our dignity matters. Just it all matters. So I think that's really powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of your knowledge. Let
Yeah.
everyone know where they can find you because I'm sure many people will listen to you and want to find you.
Yeah, so my Substack is called Motherhood Until Yesterday. And so I think it's elenabridgers.substack.com, but if you Google Motherhood Until Yesterday, you should be able to find it. And then my Instagram is elena.bridgers. That's mainly where I'm talking about this stuff these days.
I love it. Thank you so much. Appreciate
Yeah, thanks for having
it.
me.
Of course. If you found value in what I'm doing here, please help me grow the podcast. And you can do one of two things. Either share the episode with a friend or leave me a review on Spotify or Apple. This will help me so much. Until next time.